which in that investigation, we spoke with, I think, close to 100 or more witnesses for this investigation. Almost every interview we asked at the end is, how has this impacted you spiritually? And the data that we received from that question was overwhelming. Wow. And so we found that the spiritual impact of the abuse on the witnesses, not just the survivors of abuse themselves, but other witnesses, right, whistleblowers, people who just had been in the culture, who had been in the environment, was so overwhelming that for us not to address that in our report would have been negligent.
Now, independent investigations are the buzz term. And anytime I hear an announcement that an independent investigation is being done, one of the first things I do is I begin to dig a little bit to try to find out why did they call it independent? And probably 8 out of 10 times I walk away going, that's not an independent investigation. And it's worse when survivors who are thinking about participating in an investigation think it's an independent investigation. So they run and sit and be interviewed by these investigators only to find out later that, in fact, it wasn't independent, and the very entity that they believe betrayed them was actually in control of the investigation. Grace doesn't do that, and that's what I love about the work we do.
If it's an investigation that's a joke, survivors know. Survivors know. You're savvy enough to pick up on, certainly at some point, that this is not what it claims to be. It's not truly independent and objective. And so you shouldn't be surprised if you engage in some sort of investigation that doesn't have those independent aspects. The problem is just going to reoccur. It's going to reoccur again. And so if you don't really, as Amy said, get to those root issues, and you don't allow a truly independent investigation to do that, don't be surprised when those issues reoccur again and again and again in your culture. And you just continue to see more and more individuals harmed.
Thanks for joining us today, and welcome to our first Grace Live information. We're so glad that you could join us today for this conversation on independent investigations. My name is Pete Singer, and I'm the Executive Director here at Grace. Grace stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, and our mission, the whole reason that we exist, is to equip churches and ministries to better recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse. We've been around since 2004. If you'd like to learn more about Grace, please check out our webpage at www.netgrace.org. We present webinars on a regular basis, often called Grace Live Conversations, similar in format to this, but a little bit different, that address a lot of different topics related to abuse and our Christian faith. To learn more about those and to view all of the history of Grace Live Conversations, please check out our YouTube page, and the link will be in the chat. Our most recent Grace Live conversation was on sexual harassment, and those topics have been very informative. So please check that out on our YouTube page. We have a lot of ground to cover today, and just so people are aware, it may go over 60 minutes. If that's the case, you're welcome to stay for the entire time, but please also be aware that this conversation will be recorded and will be placed on our YouTube page, like those Grace conversations that I talked about, so that you'll be able to view them later if you aren't able to finish them today. Well, today I am really honored to be joined by 3 seasoned investigators. Over the past decade and more, they have pioneered best practices for independent investigations of abuse and misconduct in churches and ministries. Robert, Amy, Boz, could I ask each of you to introduce yourselves and just let people know a little bit of your background and some of the expertise that you bring to the conversation today?
Well, good afternoon. If you're in the Eastern time zone anyway, my name is Robert Peters, Director of Institutional Response here at Grace. My background is as a former child abuse prosecutor. Long ago, I studied criminal law under Boz Javidjian. It seems like another lifetime. In addition to child abuse prosecution in the great state of West Virginia, for the past 4 years, I've been a Department of Justice designated trainer of child abuse prosecutors and law enforcement nationally through organizations like the Zero Abuse Project, NW3C, the National White Collar Crime Center, and I'm also the founder of SHIELD Task Force, which does primarily abuse prevention education throughout the state of West Virginia. So great to be with you here this afternoon.
Hi, I'm Amy Steer, and I'm a licensed attorney in the state of Texas. I recently, before doing the work that I do now, I worked with Grace. So I worked with Grace for about 10 years as an investigator, and then also helping to run the investigation department. And now I have a private practice with my husband and do some consulting on the side through my own company. So it's so great to be here with you all, and I look forward to having this conversation.
I guess that's me. Good afternoon. My name is Boz Chividjian, just Boz, and I helped start Grace back in 2004. Seems like another life ago. I think Robert, I'm not sure if you were born yet, but anyway, starting Grace, I'll go in a little bit about that in a little bit later with regard to how we got into investigations. But after starting Grace, I continued. I'm a lawyer by trade, continued practicing law, then went and taught law for 12 years, and left to come back to Florida in 2020 to focus a law practice exclusively on representing sexual abuse survivors in civil lawsuits around the country. And so that's what I do now. But I've had plenty of experience doing investigations, not only as a prosecutor, but in my years working with Grace. And really, even since then, as a lawyer, every time you get a case, you have to engage in some form of investigation to be able to collect the evidence and utilize that evidence later on down the road. So I'm glad to be here. I'm so thrilled to be with these two who have been on the front lines of investigations for Grace for quite a while.
Wow, great. Thank you so much. We really, really are honored to have each of you here, and just the vast experience that you bring, and not just experience, but a heart and passion for this work, for caring for people who've been harmed by abuse and misconduct, and for helping churches and faith communities do a better job. Well, to get our conversation started off, can you maybe just even help us understand why would we do an investigation? And part of that is, in general, why would we do an investigation? And then also, what brought Grace into this field where Grace does investigations? Boz, you started Grace. Can you start off our conversation on that?
Sure. When we started Grace in 2004, I remember sitting in the back office of Diane Langberg's office in Philadelphia and just talking about what we thought the purpose of Grace would be in this world. And we never even mentioned, I don't think, the term investigations or assessments or institutional response. It wasn't even our vocabulary. And probably about three to 4 years into Grace, as we're developing it and continue to pull it together, we were approached by a large missionary organization who had heard of us. I can't remember how. And they said, listen, we had a boarding school in West Africa. It has since closed, but back in the 80s and 90s, we had a number of the kids who went to that boarding school. They were all missionary kids. We had a number of those kids who stepped forward later on and told us that they had been sexually abused by other missionaries, dorm parents, teachers. And we don't really think we dealt with it well back then. And now they're older and they're really angry, and we think we need to do an investigation. And would you all be willing to do that? And Pete, I'm like, I don't know what they're talking about. I've never done, I had done investigations as a prosecutor, but in this context was very new to me. And one of the things I thought was really important is that they had recognized, at the very least, they had recognized that they were not equipped to do their own investigation. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of the beginning for me understanding what we mean by independent investigations. Because for a long time, there have been investigations being done. I mean, workplace around the world. If something goes on, HR brings in and does an internal investigation and comes up with a report, and they make certain employment decisions with regard to that. But this whole notion of what is an independent investigation really began to dawn on me, and also I began to see how important and valuable an independent investigation is. So take you back to 2000, let's say 8, when we did this independent investigation, we finally said, we'll do it. We weren't sure, like, who's going to do this? I mean, I was teaching at the time. I said, okay, I've got some time to do this, but like, where do we find investigators? And finally it hit us that the board got together and they're like, well, we've got 2 former prosecutors, we've got a clinical psychologist, we've got a theologian. I guess the Board of Grace is going to do this investigation. And we did. And we thought it was going to take a couple weeks. Boy, were we wrong. About a year later, we finished the investigation. Diane Langberg, who was part of that investigation, said soberly that we all left a little bit of our souls behind in that investigation because of what we learned and discovered had gone on in the lives of these young people. And, you know, one of the things that I realized during that process, and I could go on and on, but I'm not going to, but one of the things I realized in that process was the value of an independent investigation, not only in the life of the organization, but also, and maybe even more importantly, in the life of the survivor. I had a lot of survivors in that investigation and subsequently who would come to me afterwards, either in person or with a note that said, I just want to let you know that sitting in that interview with your investigators was a life-changing moment in my life. Mm-hmm. For the very first time, I had known Christians who didn't try to preach at me, didn't just try to pray over me, didn't open their Bible. They just actually listened to me for the first time. And that made such a significant difference in the investigation. I've often said that my early years of investigations, I was so focused on the outcome. And sometimes the organization would do well on the outcome. Sometimes the organization wouldn't do so well with the recommendations we made, and you'd get discouraged. And then one day it hit me like, maybe I need to be focusing, yes, the outcome's important, but the process itself, the process of an independent investigation done by experts who have experience and knowledge on the various dynamics of the culture within Christianity and the theology behind it, that can actually make a profound difference in the lives of those participating in the investigation. So ever since then, that just continued one investigation. Just every time I think, well, this is the last investigation we'll ever do, we got another one and another one. And then over time, and Robert and Amy can do a better job of explaining how that developed to what we have today. The last thing I'll say real quickly is this notion of, and I cannot emphasize this enough, this notion of independent versus internal investigation. Grace started doing independent investigations when nobody else was doing them. I mean, we actually chartered new territory when it comes to investigations, because at the time we were doing this, some agencies were saying they were doing independent investigations, but they weren't. They were internal investigations labeled as independent investigations. And so when we stepped into this space, the independence was really, really critical. And we wanted to make sure we're not just independent in name only, but we are truly independent, which ultimately means for me, and that'd be a whole nother conversation, is who is ultimately in control of that investigation. If the church or organization that engage the investigation, if they are ultimately in charge, it is an internal investigation. If they're sitting in the driver's seat of the investigation, it's an internal investigation. The independent investigation means, listen, we will negotiate with you to do this investigation, and then we step back and Grace sits in the driver's seat. And it may not sound like a big difference. I can tell you after years of doing these investigations, it's fundamental in the difference of if it's independent and internal. And we live in a world today where now independent investigations are the buzz term. And anytime I hear an announcement that an independent investigation is being done, one of the first things I do is I begin to dig a little bit to try to find out why did they call it independent? And probably 8 out of 10 times I walk away going, that's not an independent investigation. Right. And it's worse when survivors who are thinking about participating in an investigation think it's an independent investigation. So they run and sit and be interviewed by these investigators only to find out later that, in fact, it wasn't independent and the very entity that they believe betrayed them was actually in control of the investigation. Grace doesn't do that. And that's what I love about the work we do.
Yeah, I remember talking to one person about an investigation that a different organization had done, and they were talking about that investigation, and they said the only thing that investigation was a mud flap. The intention of that investigation was to direct the dirt.
Yeah, well, that's a great description. Sadly,
yeah,
good.
Well, Boz, thanks for helping us understand why it is so important to have that independent lens, to be able to have that independent investigation when there are significant allegations of abuse or misconduct. But a lot of us just really don't know then what to expect. The church may announce, hey, we're going to do an investigation, or a ministry might announce we're going to do this independent investigation. But then there is just a really big question of what comes next. Robert, right now you're the Director of Institutional Response for Grace. You oversee Grace's investigations and organizational assessments. Can you give us a sense? I know that each investigation is unique and different, but can you give us a sense generally what comes next? What is involved if an organization chooses to do an independent investigation?
Yeah, so as Boz mentioned, initially there's this negotiation phase where we're establishing what's the scope of the investigation. And as you mentioned, that's where that variation from case to case tends to come in. Is this something where we're looking at the actions or allegations against a specific individual? Is it looking more historically at what's gone on within a particular faith community ever, or for a period of decades potentially, as is the case with some of our investigations? Is this something that's broader in terms of a denominational type of assessment or investigation? So establishing what that scope is, critically in all of that scope, we're going to delve into cultural factors, which I know we'll talk about in just a little bit. It's not simply going to be a quick, here's what happened and we're done. It's going to explore the so what as well as the what. And that's just simply a non-negotiable piece of any Grace investigation, including what the scope has to include. There are plenty of options in terms of just getting sort of the surface level facts. It's a much bigger deal, and it's much more important to delve into the so what. How did this happen? How do we address this in the future? How do we reckon with it? And not simply how do we get sort of a basic recitation of broadly what occurred. So once that scope is established, the church or organization we work with, as Boz mentioned, missions agencies, schools, other parachurch organizations or denominations. Once that scope is established, that entity will settle on a liaison. This is someone who doesn't have a close factual connection to the case itself. This is someone who communicates regularly with our investigation team, be that in obtaining documents or assisting with existing contact information for known witnesses, things of that nature. We'll also, of course, initially appoint our investigative team. And one of the things I love about Grace's approach, and one of the things that drew me to this role, is that this is a multidisciplinary team in a true sense. We have individuals with diverse skill sets, extensive law enforcement background. We have individuals on our team with decades, plural, of law enforcement experience. We have seasoned abuse prosecutors, seasoned civil attorneys, theologians on our staff as well, and others. Obviously, Pete being a therapist with an extensive background in trauma. So there's this multidisciplinary team that's appointed, and we do pick those teams really tailored for particular cases where we feel that specific areas of their expertise is going to be uniquely helpful for the institutions and for the survivors in that particular case. Once that team is established, we get off into the document review phase. Again, that's going to vary depending on what the scope is. Potentially, or probably always, we're getting into issues of policy, protection policies, and it's not just a backwards-looking process, it's also a forward-looking process. How can we truly help create a culture that honors and protects survivors and children, and not simply looking at the past, though the past is critical to reckon with if where we're going to move. So we have that document review piece. We also typically, though not always, conduct surveys to identify potential additional witnesses, dynamics, things that we can follow up on through our investigative process. We conduct interviews with a host of witnesses. Those interviews are done in a trauma-informed manner. This is not a law enforcement investigation. These are not interrogations. We don't haul witnesses into dimly lit rooms. We don't kick in doors. Occasionally I get nostalgic for my days in prosecution, but it's different. It's a fundamentally different process. And then we get into the analysis piece, and we're synthesizing all of these facts, and we're drawing out themes that we think are really critical for that faith community, the faith community leadership to grapple with in terms of honoring the experiences of all involved, and really thinking through, what harm was caused, how did the church respond to the allegations, how should it have, and there's that comparison of how those actions compare to Scripture critically, which should be a part of our response as Christian organizations, and then also how it compares to trauma-informed principles, which I think we'll get into briefly. And so we draft a report that synthesizes all of the above. We'll then have what we term an embargo period, where report is provided critically both to designated members of church leadership and to survivors. That's another non-negotiable piece. We have had institutions that have sought to insist on it. We haven't violated it. We won't violate it. That's a part of the independence and objectivity. Survivors get a copy of the report, full stop. And so in that process, we're seeking feedback on anything that's inconsistent with the church theology. We want to make sure that this is consistent, with the church's polity, with its theology, with its ecclesiology. We don't want to give recommendations that can't be implemented by virtue of some error around that. We're also ensuring that the feedback that's given is not a revision. It's not an editing process. This is an independent investigation. It's going to produce an independent report. But is there anything in there that's too identifying, for example, of a survivor? We're, of course, very sensitive to ensuring the confidentiality of that piece. And so then at the conclusion of the embargo period, the investigative team considers feedback from reporting victims as well as from institutions in their discretion. They may make changes, they may not. And then that report is distributed, and then we'll give guidance when requested if we have thoughts on how that report could be handled.
Wow, that's really helpful just to be able to conceptualize and kind of see stage by stage how things go, how things progress. One of the things that's really important to know as well, if you or your faith community is thinking about doing an independent investigation through Grace or through another organization, having an independent investigation through an organization like Grace is never a replacement for something that needs to be reported to law enforcement or child protection. This is not, should I report to child protection or should I report to Grace? That child protection report, that law enforcement report is a mandate, both legally in many situations and also morally and ethically. And so then if law enforcement becomes involved, we would make sure that before we would begin an investigation that law enforcement or child protection is okay with us doing that, and that they do not feel that it would conflict with that in any way. So we want to be really clear about that. Grace or any other independent investigation does not replace law enforcement or child protection. Robert, you mentioned a number of key pieces in that process, including the analysis piece, looking at pieces of the culture, and you referenced theology. So this is really complex. And when I think of a person with a legal background coming in or a person with a law enforcement background coming in, they may not always have a deep theological framework. I mean, sometimes they do. I know some very theologically minded police and very theologically minded attorneys, but often that is not the hallmark of their profession. Yet this is central to an investigation for the church. Amy, can you describe a little bit more about that? Because I know during your time at Grace, you made sure that, and Robert continues this, but you really made sure that reports had that strong biblical and theological analysis as a central piece of the report. Can you help us understand that a little bit more, Amy?
Sure, Pete. And this is something that back in the early days, so I joined Grace in 2012 for the Bob Jones investigation. That was my first investigation with Grace. And through that investigation, I was telling the team the other day on a call that I was ill-equipped, honestly, to understand the significant spiritual harm that had occurred as a result of the abuse. And I say I was ill-equipped. I just had a little bit of knowledge of it, but did not understand and appreciate the gravity of the impact. And so as we started speaking with witnesses, which in that investigation we spoke with, I think, close to 100 or more witnesses for this investigation, almost every interview we asked at the end is, how has this impacted you spiritually? And the data that we received from that question was overwhelming.
Wow.
And so we found that the spiritual impact of the abuse on the witnesses, not just the survivors of abuse themselves, but other witnesses, whistleblowers, people who just had been in the culture, who had been in the environment, was so overwhelming that for us not to address that in our report would have been negligent. And so I always say this now, it's like to not address a theological impact of an assessment of abuse in a church or in a faith investigation. I think it makes it an incomplete. It's incomplete. The report is incomplete if it doesn't fully address how this has impacted someone spiritually. And also, really, I think the thing that Grace does really great about their investigations is incorporating not just the spiritual impact, but how the spiritual impact is related to trauma. And the integration of trauma and faith, and really, how can we help our readers? When I am writing a report, I try to think of all the different audiences that are going to be reading this report. You have the victims, you have the churches, you have other people who may just be bystanders who are interested. You may have the media. How can we write this report in such a way that captures not just the severe impact of what happened on the individual survivors, their abuse, but the severe impact of the culture as a whole had on those that we spoke with? And if we can really wrap all of those two things up really well so that the person reading it really grasps and understands not just the abuse, but like the cultural environment that sort of lays the whole framework, I feel like it's a good report and we've done our job well. That when someone gets done reading our report, they don't just understand what happened, but they get a really complete picture of the whole situation, including culture. And so that's why I think it's really important that when we're investigating, especially in faith institutions, we have to analyze the culture and the theology, because that's really what we're grounded in. If we say we're Christian, we're grounded in theology, we're grounded in our faith and in scriptural tenets. And so if we aren't analyzing that, are we really who we say we are? And so I always say I said this to a pastor one time, at the end of our report, we were kind of going through it, and he said something to me, and I said, well, what you've done is you've come in and you've plucked all the bad fruit off the tree, but you haven't really gone to the root of the problem. You haven't really rooted out those deep, painful, sick, dead roots. And it was like a light bulb went off in that pastor's head. And I think that when we're talking about theological and even cultural assessing that happens in an investigation and in a report, that's really what it is. It's because, scriptures say that you will know a person by their fruit, and a good tree bears good fruit, and a bad tree bears bad fruit. And a good tree doesn't bear bad fruit, and a bad tree doesn't bear good fruit. And it's in Matthew, and I think it's Christ talking. He goes on to say that. And likewise, you can tell a person by their actions. Like, fruit is equivalent to actions. And so I think when institutions want to come in and just look at the actual allegations or the incident, or look at one bad actor, maybe one pastor who's engaged in the abuse, maybe remove that pastor, look at what happened with that pastor, then move on, it sort of has the effect of putting a Band-Aid on it and just getting on with the day, rather than really assessing, how did this person get here? How were they empowered? What power and authority did we give this person that they were then allowed to create this environment where this abuse occurred? And those kinds of questions, when you really want to weed out bad fruit, you have to look at the roots of how the fruit became bad. And I think that's what a lot of institutional cultures don't want to do, is really get to the deep dive of what did we do to contribute to this? How did we maybe were complicit? I know that word complicit is maybe a buzzword, but honestly, like, how were we complicit in allowing this person to have power and maybe not creating accountability structures, giving them power when they shouldn't have? All of these things, when we aren't assessing these things, we're not getting to the root issues. And I think as Christians, we should want to get to the root issues so that we can become trees that bear good fruit. And that starts at the root. So that's why I think that theology is important. I'm sure there's a lot more on the cultural piece that I didn't hit on. I think it's one of my things that I'm so passionate about. I think that writing a report, for me, my colleague and I, who I used to do this work with, she's not at Grace anymore, but we used to feel like writing these Grace reports was almost like writing a dissertation every time.
Yeah.
Because you're having to make sure that you're, putting what needs to be on paper there. But that cultural piece and the theological analysis really needs to be there.
Yeah. So much of what you said, I think, is just so profound. And it makes me think of the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? And as Jesus is talking about, what does it mean to be a neighbor? What does he choose as an example? A story of assault and abuse. And the story of what it means to be a neighbor is how you respond when you know somebody has been assaulted and abused. And we can point to the things that so many people did wrong in that story. There's only one group of people that actually attacked the person. The sin of the other people is that they didn't respond. And helping our churches to understand that and to see that we're called to be like the Samaritan in how we respond to somebody who's been assaulted, somebody who's been abused. And as you talked about theology, I know we encounter issues around theology, and one person had mentioned this in a question is, how do you deal with when there's a strong theological block? And so just to address that real quickly before getting to another question, often what we do is rather than trying to get a church or a denomination to change theology, we hope to explore that theology and identify risks that might be associated with a belief system, and then work with that church or that denomination or other organization to say, okay, now that we've identified the risks that come with our beliefs, how do we manage those risks? Because if you choose to hold a belief, you're responsible for managing the risk that comes with that belief. So that's often how we deal with that.
Well, and Pete, I just want to add this really quick, just on the theological piece. I know someone had put in here, how do you address bad theology? And that's what you're just talking about, when the bad theology is a part of the culture and of some churches. And, like you mentioned, just really helping to explain it in a way that this is how the theology has impacted survivors of abuse. And I think sometimes we think we have to change complete structures and everything. And sometimes that's necessary, but sometimes it's just as little as like flipping a little switch, right? Of like changing a little thing. And being honest and transparent about what your beliefs are. That's what I see a lot of problems with churches is they will say that they believe one thing publicly, but that's their policy. But in practice, it's different. And so if you're honest and you're transparent of like, this is what we believe, then people can go to your website and be like, oh, they believe in this. That's not going to be a good fit for me. But when we're not honest with what we believe, one example that I'm thinking off the top of my head is just like women in leadership. Like that's like a very like thing that a lot of people like, just be honest with what you believe about that. And so that people can make a statement about it, so people can make the decision if that's a good place for them. That's like a less, low-lying fruit. But what I've seen is that the spiritual impact, Pete, like what you were talking about, is how we respond. I've had so many survivors tell me over the years that they've spent more years in therapy dealing with how the institution responded to them than they did the actual initial sexual abuse. And that was honestly, when I started hearing that in the Bob Jones investigation, I was floored. I was shocked. And honestly, that has been a theme over the past 10 years. I hear it time and time again. And as a church, that should really alarm us, because how we have the power to help people heal, and how we respond that might put them back. And it's just like I was saying in a call the other day, it's like another layer of abuse. So we have the spiritual or the sexual abuse that's occurred. And then we have the spiritual abuse that's on top of it because it's in a faith institution. And then we have the institutional response. So when we as a church don't respond well to abuse, we're adding another layer of abuse on that survivors are now having to process with their therapists and in their life. And it just really, really, really can put them in a really bad place, and rightly so. And so that's why I think it's so important to address the theological pieces as an educational piece to help us to understand, and also to help so we can try to shift our culture so that we can be agents of change and agents of healing for survivors rather than agents of more harm.
Yeah. Especially when we're saying that we represent Christ. And we're saying we represent Christ and then causing harm. And that can't be the case. If anyone is interested in reading a little bit more about some of the spiritual impact of abuse, you can go to our website, and under resources, there's an article called Wounded Souls, and that will give you some additional information. That article looks specifically at child abuse. Grace, through investigations and prevention, looks at abuse across the lifespan, whether that would be sexual harassment, clergy sexual abuse, child physical abuse, intimate partner violence, all types of abuse across the lifespan. But that article in particular is looking at the spiritual impact of child abuse. And so I'd encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about the spiritual impact, to go to our website under resources and find that article called Wounded Souls. A lot of what each of you has shared has ended up in one way or another coming back to power. Power, it seems, is inseparable from abuse. And then when Grace or another organization comes in to do an investigation, we're also coming in with power. So Robert, can you help us understand a little bit, how does Grace address some of those power dynamics? And also, how do we make sure that we're using power in a way that honors the others involved in this investigation with us?
Yeah, so this is so critical, and that power leveling aspect is really critical for the discernment of truth. An example I would give, going back to my days in prosecution, is a good prosecutor isn't going to throw a child into a courtroom and say good luck and not have there be any sort of preparation, with the victim, not have there be any sort of courtroom accommodations with the victim. There has to be a bit of a power leveling for the jury to be able to reach or discern truth. If that work isn't done, then that child's put in a tremendously unfair position. Right. So there has to be an initial power leveling, and that means articulating to the child in child-friendly terms who the different players are in the courtroom. It means courtroom accommodations that prevent the alleged offender from jumping up and getting near them and intimidating them. It prevents, if we ever approach the judge, which we often do, preventing the alleged offender from going near the witness stand if the child's still on the stand. There's pieces like that that are critical to level the power so the child can even be in a space to articulate the truth, and so the jury can be in a position to discern the truth. If there's not power leveling, more often than not, there's not discernment of truth. And so what that tends to look like in this context, which is certainly different, from a criminal prosecution, a lot of that goes to the way we structure our investigations, even at the contractual level. We talked about the importance of independence. Grace contracts with with churches, with church institutions, but the contracts are unique. And oftentimes we'll have those discussions, as churches are inquiring about our services. They are unique. And they'll often be correctly flagged by attorneys as unusual contracts. Well, they are, and that's for a reason. It's to ensure that there is a power leveling. It's enabled to ensure that it is a truly independent, objective investigation where grace investigators are making the determination of, for example, how many witnesses to interview, which witnesses to interview, what to ask about within the scope of the investigation. And so those are really critical pieces that ensure, as Boz said earlier, grace is in the driver's seat. And here's what I would say to churches is you should really want that as well. Because if it's an investigation that's a joke, survivors know. Survivors know. You're savvy enough to pick up on, certainly at some point, that this is not what it claims to be, that it's not truly independent and objective. And so you shouldn't be surprised if you engage in some sort of investigation that doesn't have those independent aspects. The problem is just going to reoccur. It's going to reoccur again. And so if you don't really, as Amy said, get to those root issues and you don't allow a truly independent investigation to do that, don't be surprised when those issues reoccur again and again and again in your culture. And you just continue to see more and more individuals harmed. So there's that structural piece of it that's sort of established at the contractual level. There's also just the way that we do the investigation. So, for example, as we mentioned earlier, we talked about, we don't just give a reporting victim a small portion of the report. They get the entire report. And we know there are instances of other firms just providing reporting victims a small little portion. And so, again, that's a joke. In terms of an assessment, a holistic assessment of what's occurring, that's not leveling the power differential. The institution's getting the full report. They're getting maybe a little snapshot into it that may even be unrelated to the rest of it and not be privy to the ultimate conclusions, the ultimate recommendations. So there's that aspect of it that simply doesn't level the power across. There's also this aspect, as you mentioned, Pete, of honoring reporting victims and witnesses throughout. As we mentioned earlier, these are not dimly lit interrogation rooms. These are questions that are conducted in a trauma-informed manner. They're structured in a way that's not coercive. And that's true of reporting victims. That's also true of alleged offenders. We treat every individual involved in the process with dignity. And so it's not a coercive process. We don't have the ability to kick in doors, throw on handcuffs, get subpoenas, get search warrants. This is all a completely voluntary process. And so another thing I would encourage for churches is to ensure, as you assess who does these independent investigations, are they conducting them in a manner where witnesses will come forward and participate and know that they'll be treated with dignity and respect throughout the process. And that power dimension is certainly considered throughout.
It's really, really essential. And we talk about how we really strive to have our investigations be conducted in a way that is consistent with trauma-informed practice. And we really try and help give guidance to churches to understand what even trauma-informed practice is. And we look at 6 key principles with that. And the 5th principle is all about empowerment, voice, and choice. And as you described that, it really is an effort of bringing that empowerment, voice, and choice into that investigative process. It is so essential. One of the things that you also mentioned in there related to power that we do or do not have. You mentioned that grace doesn't have subpoena power. Grace doesn't kick down doors. One of the things that grace also cannot do is start a rogue investigation on our own. So some people are wondering how could an investigation get started? And for a grace investigation, given the fact that there is not subpoena power, and given the fact that in order for that investigation to really be effective, we need to be able to access people at the church or ministry, and we need to be able to access documents and records from that organization. It has to be something that particular faith community agrees to participate in. And then that faith community would also be responsible for paying for the investigation. So The discussion of power really highlights just how much people have been through already by the time we get to the point of an investigation. An investigation doesn't typically occur when everything is going perfectly well. An investigation doesn't typically occur when nobody has been harmed. And so as we head into this and we recognize many people who are going to participate in an investigation are going to come in already carrying some deep wounds, and that then telling parts of that story to an investigator, opening that part of their experience, that part of their soul, to another person can be extremely difficult, can be extremely hard. And it is essential in those contexts that reported victims and that witnesses are cared for. Amy, can you help us understand how can we care for a reported victim or a witness that is involved with a Grace investigation?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So our investigative teams are trauma-informed. Some of that is based on just people's experience, that they've worked for a long time with survivors and have a deep understanding for trauma based on their own research, their own studies, their own backgrounds and experiences. But Grace also does do training for our team on what it means to be trauma-informed. So that includes things of, one, how we conduct our interviews. So we're trained in how to ask questions in a way that that's not victim blaming, that's open-ended, that lets the victim or the witness really guide the conversation and share with us what they're comfortable. I think that's what a lot of people may not understand about Grace investigations, or really most independent investigations, is that, well, the way that Grace conducts them is that it's completely voluntary. And so that is honestly, for me, the part that has been the most inspiring and amazing part of the work that I did at Grace, was that knowing that all of this was completely voluntary, yet the amount of data and information that we have been able to gather and collect from people who have just been willing to sit down with us and share their stories with us, bare their souls, and do so in such a way that's just so vulnerable and so open, is not lost on me. I think that is the greatest, truly the greatest joy, and just such a sacred honor that someone who, and I always say this in so many interviews, I realize that I'm a complete stranger. You just met me when you walked in the room. And the fact that you would share your story with me is not lost on me, because you don't know me from Adam. You don't know what I'm going to really do with this information. But that's a huge part of Grace, is that earning that trust, and, with the witnesses and with survivors, which is really, I think, what Grace has done really well, is earn that trust that we are able to get the information that we need in a way that's voluntary. So yeah, just making sure that our team is trauma informed, I think, is a huge one. Every witness gets a copy of their interview transcript, which I think is huge, because after you interview, you get a copy of your transcript, and then you get to sign off that you agree, and that the information can be used in the final report. So I think that's huge, because it gives people autonomy, which is a trauma-informed principle. That's empowerment, voice, and choice of their statement to us. And if people want to remove or redact portions of their testimony, they can, and that will not end up in our report. Another thing that Grace does is ensuring that victims' names and identities, as much as we can. Sometimes it's hard to maintain someone's identity, that they wouldn't be, but their name, if they're a victim, will not be used in our report, and trying to really help preserve people's privacy and respect that to every extent we can. And then those are just some things that are coming off the top of my mind. I'm sure I've missed something, but I'll say this: when my colleague and I were doing this work, we had probably been doing it. It was after the Bob Jones investigation. we were in the middle of another investigation, and a huge part of the work for these investigators is victim care. And we started just realizing the amount of witnesses that we had and the amount of victim care that we were doing in addition to the investigations. That would be, I mean, I remember one investigation, we had someone who just, there were some real mental health concerns. And so me and the investigator honestly were the ones that that witness had reached out to. And so we were, trying to play mental health helper and all of the things in which we love to do. We love this work. And so it's our great joy to do that. But we came to Boz and we said, we really think we need a victim support specialist, someone who can also come alongside victims, alongside the investigators, so that the investigators can gather the information and do the investigation. And then if there's ever anything that people need, whether mental health support, just someone to talk to, someone to ask questions to, like, it'd be great if we had someone on our team who could do that. And that's where Kathy Weens came into the picture. And Kathy is just such a kind soul and just such an amazing person. And she does such a great job of supporting the victims in the investigations. And the wonderful part about Kathy is that she herself has been through a Grace investigation. So she understands the process really well. And I think that's a really, really, really wonderful part about the multidisciplinary team that Grace has really created, is that we have investigators. And also what that does is it allows investigators to maintain their independence, that no one can come along the side and say, oh, well, you're just a victim advocate because you offer all this victim support as an investigator. And it's honestly, we still do that. That's still a part of our job. As being a trauma-informed investigator, we're always going to do that. But having someone else to come alongside us and help us with that, I think is really great. So awesome. That's how we did it. And afterwards, there's so much that we can say about cares for survivors afterwards. I mean, this is just, I don't know if I'm the proper person to answer this, because I feel like it doesn't always get done well, quite frankly, by the institution. But hopefully Grace can come alongside the survivor as needed afterwards. If they have questions about our report, if anything that is kind of left unanswered, we can be there for survivors to kind of walk through them. And honestly, I still keep in contact with many survivors that I've met over my years at Grace. And that is one of my most favorite parts about this job. It's just the people that I've met, and that they invite me into their life now, to just continue to walk with them. And so I think that's what Grace does too, is we still have relationships with people we've met through these investigations. Yeah.
Wow, that's great. And thank you so much for really helping to bring Kathy on board and making sure that support was there. And typically Kathy's support is always available for at least 6 months after the conclusion of the investigation, and at times we lengthen that as well. Because it's certainly not one of those things where, well, now the report's done, the impact on me is over. It continues, and so it's good to be able to have that available to people for a while after.
And
before go ahead,
sometimes the report brings up additional things that survivors maybe didn't know before the report came out. So it might enter them into a whole new phase of healing. And so Grace can also work with survivors, and Kathy can, to help them if they need new resources or need new connections or whatever, to help them in that. If there's like a new, phase that the investigation uncovered information that puts them on another process of healing. So yeah, that's so huge. It doesn't end with the report. I mean, we've even just within the last year or so, we issued a report, and it was a situation where the police really weren't able to do all that much because statutes of limitations and things like that. And so we had done the report, and after that report was released, the report chronicled 2 reported victims. After the report was released, a 3rd victim came forward and said,
he abused me too. The difference was that person was still a minor, and the statute of limitations had not expired. And then police were able to pursue a law enforcement investigation. But that wouldn't have happened. And that person who was still a minor that hadn't come forward yet was waiting because he didn't know how people would respond. And he wasn't going to enter into that investigation and make himself vulnerable without seeing that first. And then once he saw the grace report and saw how that was handled and received, then he came forward. And his coming forward, that courage that he showed to come forward after seeing the grace report, is what allowed police to pursue that matter that previously they had not been able to. So it does continue impacting afterwards, and it does open things up. And for many people, they identify it as something that's not easy, but that helps put things in context, this quest for context that we're all on. Before I jump to the next question, I want to throw in another just a little piece of information. You've heard us use this term trauma-informed several times. And I just want to give people that might be listening a little bit of context about what we mean by trauma-informed. When we talk about trauma-informed practice, when we're talking about how we try and do things with the grace investigation, and when we talk about things that we're looking at in the church culture as part of our analysis, we focus on 6 key principles. And these 6 key principles were put out by and put forward by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And in addition to that, they are all firmly grounded in Scripture. We'll have an article coming out later this year in Currents in Theology and Mission that will look at each of these 6 principles, establish a biblical basis for each, and then explore how each of these principles can be applied in the church. These 6 principles are safety, physical safety, psychological safety, spiritual safety, trustworthiness, and transparency. The idea behind trustworthiness is not that you owe me trust, you should trust me. Rather, the idea is it is my responsibility to act in a way that is worthy of trust. And if at some point you choose to trust me, okay, but that's not what determines whether or not it's my responsibility to act in a way that is worthy of trust. It's just what I'm already called to do. And then transparency relates to what information is shared, how it is shared, with whom it is shared. So those are the first 2. The third is peer support, which looks at how are basic needs being met, as well as how are we helping people with shared experience to also be able to speak into the lives of people. 4th principle is collaboration and mutuality, which looks at how are we collaborating with the person that has been harmed, how are we collaborating within our own groups, and how are we collaborating across groups. As mentioned a couple of times, the 5th principle is empowerment, voice, and choice. And then the 6th principle is humility in the face of historical, cultural, and gender factors associated with the trauma that simply cannot be separated from the trauma because they're so embedded within trauma. So as you hear us talking about trauma-informed practice, as you hear us talking about trying to have these principles within our investigations and looking at church culture and assessing these within church culture as part of the investigation, those are really the 6 key principles that we're talking about. Unfortunately, there are organizations that don't bring those principles into the work that they do. There are at times investigations that are done more from a liability perspective, more from let's do this to protect the church perspective, rather than let's do this to seek accountability and justice. Let's do this to care for those who might be harmed. And when an investigation is done, either with a motive that is not Christ-like, or when an investigation is done without incorporating these principles, there are times that it can bring harm. And I know, Boz, you've talked about a lot of instances where you have seen that occur. Can you help us understand some of the things, some of the ways that people actually may be harmed by an investigation that is not done with an understanding of trauma, and that is not done with a quest for justice, accountability, truth, and care?
Yeah, before I do that, I want to touch on one thing. I think somebody asked it, which I think is a good question. Somebody said, well, what do you do with, how do you keep people from exploiting this process with regard to false allegations? And I think it's a legitimate question. And, the thing I would say to that is, you first start off with the objective data, which says anywhere between 3 and 7% of disclosures are false, which is quite a lower number than most people think. But we acknowledge it exists. But that's the critical importance of having experts in the field doing what we're doing and doing thorough independent investigations. Because I can tell you, as my years as a prosecutor, my years with Grace, even my years working now as an attorney, if you do that thorough investigation by informed, experienced, knowledgeable investigators, that type of investigation will usually be able to ascertain whether the credibility of testimony of witnesses, and that leads me to this issue, which I think is really important, and that is expectations, because that goes into what you were just talking about. Because I think a lot of times both witnesses, reported victims, and churches go into these investigations with the wrong expectations. And one of the things is, well, you're going to adjudicate somebody guilty or innocent in these investigations. No, adjudication is a legal term used in the court system. This is not a court system, as we talked about before. This is a voluntary, independent investigation. So what these investigations do, primarily, number one, is we have to focus on the reported conduct of perpetrators. Law enforcement will do that too in many of these cases. One of the things that Grace does that law enforcement really won't do is really focus on what the church or institution did or didn't do in protecting or failing to protect the reported victims, and how the church responded to it. Police officers, criminal investigators don't really care about that type of stuff. And so they focus on the perpetrator, but they're not really focused on, well, okay, could this have been prevented? Were there warning signs? Were there warnings with regard to this particular person, church leadership? So understanding what is an investigation, what is an expectation of an investigation, really makes a big difference, Pete, because if you're going into it, if a church, because I've seen a lot of churches, and we have to communicate this up front. If they go into it going, okay, you're going to do this investigation, and then you're going to come to a determination of, well, we think there's greater than likely that this person did, and maybe not, and you're adjudicating. They're waiting for that. And more often than not, Grace doesn't do that. What we do is we have a factual findings. So we spent all this time investigating, interviewing, collecting all this data. But like Amy has talked about, can't just collect the data and sit on it, or just say, here's all the data. You take the expertise, and that's, again, why it's so important to have experts with a lot of training and experience, and not only investigating, but also in these theological components and the understanding the culture of these Christian organizations, and being able to take that, synthesize that into what they were talking about, into this analysis, so that when somebody reads the report, they're not coming up to the end of the report going, okay, guilty or innocent. They're actually reading a substantive report that provides way more information than that. And ultimately, what I always thought when I was working at Grace was to come up with a determination of guilt or innocence is actually too easy for churches. We're going to provide you all the information. We're going to do the analysis, but you know what? You're going to take ownership in making a decision on what you do with the information we provide you. We're going to give you recommendations, but it's too easy for churches to go, well, Grace said this, so we'll do this. Well, yeah, we want churches to actually engage in the process, and most do, that take the information, review it, analyze it, learn from it, and then go, based on this, we as a church are going to take ownership in making decisions to demonstrate authentic repentance to those who've been hurt and changing how we do business in the future in this church so something like this never happens again. I think, to be more specific with your answer to your question, I have, in my role now as a lawyer, I have lots of victims and survivors who approach me and say, I participated in an investigation that my church had, and I thought this was going to be great. And I walked away from that investigation, certainly not empowered. In fact, I walked away feeling exploited, and I walked away feeling betrayed. And so once again, the institution has betrayed me. And it's really important for people to understand that most people who've been a part of the church life, they want to believe the church is going to do the right thing. They want to believe the church is going to take, or the Christian organization is going to take the right steps. So when they hear from the church that, hey, we're going to do an investigation, the immediate response is, oh, great, I want to participate. And when anybody calls me beforehand and says, hey, this organization is doing this investigation, they want me to participate, I'm really excited they're doing this. This is an answer to prayer. I say, well, slow down. Before you step into that investigation, ask some really important questions. Because once you step into that investigation and you sit down with those investigators, whether you know it or not, you are legitimizing that process. And so you don't want to step into an illegitimate process. You don't want to step into what you think is an independent investigation, only to learn halfway through, or maybe not till afterwards, that this was not an independent investigation at all, but it was an internal investigation done for the benefit of the organization. And guess what? Unbeknownst to you, you just helped them in that endeavor. So you have to ask some really significantly important questions before you dive into that. And so I talk to a lot of people who come to me afterwards and go, man, I was asked to come sit in an interview. I was really happy that they were doing this investigation. I said, of course. But then what they did is they took this treasure. I mean, your experience as a victim is a well-guarded, valuable treasure of your life. And you are now sitting in a room and you're handing that treasure usually to a complete stranger. They better treat that as it is, your treasure.
Yeah.
And what I have found more often than not is in non-grace investigations is so many survivors walk away going, wow, I felt like I was just used and exploited, and I gave away my treasure, and now I can't do anything to take it back. And so the thing I love about the grace investigations and the grace investigation process and our approach is that we understand what is the focus of the investigation. We understand that at the end of the day, we want to respect and empower victims and not exploit and betray them. So that when a reported victim walks out of our process, and when they actually get a copy of the entire report, as Robert was saying, that empowers them, that reminds them that they hold great value, not only in our investigation, but in life in general, that we value them so much that, yes, you are no less valuable than this church because they're getting the same document that you are. That's significant. That's profound in the life. And that goes back to what I said earlier. It's not just the outcome, it's the process. And at the end of the day, if these investigative processes can help reshape the DNA of churches and Christian organizations, while at the same time empower victims and give them hope and validity and value, then I think it's accomplished what it needs to accomplish. But it takes a lot of hard work, and it's taken Grace years to understand and develop this, and years to earn the trust and credibility of so many of those who've been hurt and abused inside churches and Christian communities.
Yeah. So it's essential, absolutely essential, that this is done well, or rather than helping, it will be re-traumatizing. It will cause more harm. So I think that really helps me to have a good understanding of the process and some of the things that make a Grace investigation unique, and some of the things that are very, very important to have involved in investigations. I have just a couple more questions for each of you, and then we will get to some of the questions that are in the Q&A. One question that I have for each of you, and if each of you could maybe pick a couple of questions that you think are really important, really essential. So if there is a church or ministry that is thinking about doing an independent investigation, maybe Grace is one of the organizations they're thinking of. Maybe they're also thinking of other investigation options, whether it would be a law firm or investigative firm or whatever it might be. What are a couple of key questions to ask that organization to determine, do they know what they're doing? Is this something that will be done in a trauma-informed way? Is this something that is potentially helpful or would instead be more harmful? Could each of you come up with a couple of questions to help that people can use to help tease that out?
Yeah, I think one of the basic ones is to explore the firm's licensure. There are, in every state, there's a different sort of licensure scheme for private investigations that may or may not be applicable, depending on what type of investigation. So determining whether the firm, whether it's a law firm or another investigative provider, is appropriately licensed. Grace is licensed in all 50 states. We also have the ability to conduct investigations internationally. And of course, there's a host of legal schemes that relate to international investigations as well that many, if not most, firms are not equipped to navigate. So that would be one question I would certainly have at the outset. I'd also be curious, at a granular level, tell me how many investigations pertinent to violence across the lifespan your particular individuals have conducted. If you ask that question of Grace, depending on our particular team members, the number is going to be in the hundreds. For some of us, it's going to be in the thousands of relevant cases. And so we're not talking about someone who maybe was once a law enforcement officer and worked a lot of traffic cases. That we're talking about sexual assault cases, child abuse cases, civil child abuse cases, criminal child abuse cases, youth with problematic sexual behavior. Some of our individuals on staff, self-included, have worked hundreds of youth with problematic sexual behavior cases. So asking those types of questions that are really getting at the core of expertise as well.
Wow, that's good.
Amy?
I think a lot of the things that we've addressed here is how, are good questions to ask. One of them being, I was on a call recently where someone said, how do you have multidisciplinary teams? How do you provide for victim care throughout an investigation? What does an investigation look like to you? Not only what experience do you have in, like Robert mentioned, like expertise and experience in the field of child sexual abuse or the specific thing that's being investigated, but what experience do you have investigating allegations of abuse in faith institutions? Mm-hmm. Because that is very different than I worked with a prosecutor on these investigations, and she's always was telling me this is so different in so many ways than a criminal investigation. And so those are some things that come to mind initially.
Yeah.
I think some open-ended questions such as, what has the organization done, or tell me what the organization has done to earn the trust of victims. Don't give them multiple choice. Just ask them. How they answer that can be pretty significant. I think basic, who, in general, when you do your investigations, who receives a copy of the final report? Again, an open-ended question. See who they tell you. If victims are left off of that list, that's a red flag. Another, in addition to what Amy and Robert has said, is, identify to us the specific investigators who will lead or participate in this investigation, and provide us a copy of their resume. Because a lot of times these investigations get going, and quite frankly, nobody really knows. They know the organization, but they don't know who are going to be the investigators who are on the front lines, who are actually sitting with these people, interviewing them. That's almost more important than who the organization is. So ask them specifically. And if they can't answer, they hum and haw and go out, or I've seen some organizations who really hold that close to the chest and they don't want to give away that information. That's a red flag as well.
That's great. I think a couple of questions that I would put out there is just ask them, what do you know about trauma?
Mm-hmm.
And how does that impact the way you do an investigation? Because if they don't know about trauma, they are not going to be able to treat witnesses well, whether that witness is one of the reported victims or whether that's a person who has seen what's going on, even if they themselves were not specifically targeted. So, yeah, asking them what they know about trauma and how that affects their investigations, those trauma-informed practices. And you can have it be open-ended. And if you hear their response and their response doesn't include significant content related to those 6 principles, then that is a red flag. And then I also think as you're looking at it, another big piece is asking them to describe what they mean by independent, and what safeguards they have in place to assure that it is an independent investigation. And that's going to be really important, one, to get to the truth, and 2, once that report is done, it's unclear necessarily who will get the report. People at the church, I'm guessing, will get the report. And if it's a grace investigation, survivors get a report. And then that report may become public. And the degree of independence that organization who did the report shows is going to impact how much people trust that report. And if that investigation shows clear signs that it was not independent, people are not going to trust that report, and it will create a longer term concern there as well. So those would be a couple of the questions that I would have. And now, are you all ready for some of the questions that have been put in the Q&A? All right. So I'm going to throw out this first one, and Amy, I think you'd be a great person to answer this. So there are a lot of people who talk about ways to handle conflict and abuse. One of them is Ken Sande. And so someone has specifically asked, what are your thoughts about Ken Sande? I'm specifically mentioning Ken Sande not because I want to throw out a huge endorsement or not because I want to knock Ken Sande. It's simply because that was the specific question, was Ken Sande.
Right. Okay. So my understanding of Ken Sande, Ken Sande aside, peacemakers is this idea that you put people in a room to kind of hash out their differences man to man based on Matthew 18, and that we would address conflict based on the biblical principles. And so in my experience in investigations, this principle comes up in every single investigation that I do, every single time, without fail. It's going to be mentioned at some point in my investigation about Matthew 18. And that is something that I do not endorse. This is, again, not about any specific person or organization, but I do not endorse a Matthew 18 principle, conflict resolution, when it involves survivors and their perpetrators, because that is an imbalance of power, and that is putting someone in harm's way. And that is not what Matthew 18 is talking about. And so as a church, it's our job to protect the vulnerable, to keep them safe. You mentioned that safety is a trauma-informed principle, and putting them in a room with their perpetrator, according to Matthew 18, which says that you must go to the person. If you have something against someone, you must go to that person. That is not what that scripture is talking about. And so I do not endorse a Matthew 18 principle in terms of conflict resolution when it involves situations of abuse. So that's my take on it.
Yeah. I think that's so important. Because Matthew 18 is, I think, pretty clearly related to a situation where we don't have that power imbalance that is often there when it comes to a situation of abuse. It's not that Jesus got it wrong. It's that we're misapplying it. We're applying it where it wasn't intended to be applied if we use Matthew 18 in that type of a situation, because that's not what it was intended for.
Mm-hmm. And in the Bob Jones report, which was clicked earlier, you can Control F Matthew 18. There's a Matthew 18 section in that report that might be really helpful for someone to read who just wants a little bit more information on that. It's too much to talk about in this.
Yeah.
We could do a whole live on Matthew 18. So
yes,
that's a resource for someone looking for more on that.
No doubt. Okay. Next question. How do independent investigations best balance the needs of the survivors, victims, with treating the alleged wrongdoer fairly? What should be disclosed about the allegation and what should not? When should someone be asked to leave a paid position or a church entirely, assuming that no wrongdoing has yet been confirmed? So a few questions in one here, and these are complex questions that we are often asked during the course of an investigation.
That's a Robert Peters question. Thank you, Buzz. Yeah. So obviously, as Amy said with the Matthew 18 question, each of these can easily justify their own grace lives. Speaking in very broad terms, in terms of balancing those needs with treating the alleged wrongdoer fairly, this is really about what Pete mentioned earlier about integrating trauma-informed principles throughout the process. We're acting in a way that promotes physical safety and psychological safety for all witnesses. And so that is reporting victims, that is alleged offenders. We're treating everyone throughout the process with dignity, and we're treating them with respect. And we may ask certainly targeted follow-up questions. There's a mix. All of us are trained in trauma-informed interviewing. So there's a mix of questions that are more broad and a mix of questions that are more direct in order to really get into the specifics of what occurred as appropriate and necessary. But the process is the same in terms of the manner in which we interview is always a trauma-informed process, regardless of who we're discussing. Again, this goes also to what Boz said earlier. You often hear the phrase "he said, she said." It's a he said, she said case. I don't know if I've actually seen a he said, she said case, meaning a true, I don't know what happened here. I have no idea. I've seen cases where we couldn't show that who was correct beyond a reasonable doubt in my time as a prosecution, but I've never seen a true he said, she said case, because more often when you look, you find out. When you know how to look, when you know how to do a thorough investigation, you tend to have a pretty good idea. Now, maybe you're not in a criminal context showing it, as I said, beyond reasonable doubt, which is not our standard here. But generally speaking, that's simply not how it's structured. So it's just sort of a fundamentally different process. And so I think some of what that question goes to is conduct a thorough process. What's fair to all involved? Conduct a thorough process. Conduct a process that makes good recommendations, that is accurate in what it presents. That should be fair to all involved, and it's respectful to all involved. In terms of what should be disclosed about the allegations and what should not be, again, this is a very context-specific question, so I hesitate to throw out any advice that's too broad. We do free initial consultations with individuals who have the types of questions. So simply reach out to us, check out netgrace.org. We'd be happy to discuss a particular scenario and what maybe should or should not be disclosed, depending on the particular situation. I will say in a broad sense, as Pete mentioned, the trauma-informed principle of trustworthiness and transparency. A lot of the mistakes that churches make in this context is a failure to be transparent. Now, there's also other considerations such as safety when we're talking about, depending on the nature of what the allegation is. So talk to an entity that knows what they're talking about as you grapple with that really important question. When should someone be asked to leave a paid position or a church entirely, assuming no wrongdoing has not yet been confirmed? I think we do have an employment lawyer on the line, but I'd say maybe even two. I think either of you are more qualified than I am for this one. But, I think the question I would be asking from a church perspective is, what do my decisions convey to reporting victims in the immediate case, and what do my decisions convey to other individuals that are absolutely within my pews? So it's more a question of guiding principles as opposed to what is, the sort of A+ gold star answer. What are my decisions communicating? Are they communicating the love of Christ? Are they communicating that this process is legitimate? And sort of using that as a guiding star in terms of how to make those decisions. Boz, any texture you would add to any of the above, particularly the last one?
No, because I don't think, if I were, at least the investigations that I participated in, we're not telling them this is what you got to do. I mean, we make recommendations based upon the analysis of the factual investigative findings of the investigation. But ultimately, part of this is helping educate a church or Christian organization in the many issues that we've already talked about, so that by the time by the time we get to the other end of a grace investigation, that church, hopefully they've been humble and teachable, will be and the leadership of that church will be much different than when we started. And that they will, maybe at the beginning of the process, they were like, you know what? Doesn't matter. We're going to forgive this guy, and we may give him a few weeks off, and he's going to come back because we're all about forgiveness and grace. And they get to the other end of the process, not just what we read in the report, but because along the investigative process, the leadership and the church itself has begun to transform and heal. And maybe they see that a little bit different by the end of the process. And that, to me, is a success with regard to the outcome of an investigation, is that we're not just coming in, doing a report, doing all their work for them and saying, here it is in this nice document, and you just do what we tell you, and then you can go back to business as usual. My hope and prayer is that this process actually begins to change the very DNA of that community into one that is much more understanding, trauma-informed, much more understanding of abuse, much more recognizing the reality and existence of survivors in their midst, and making decisions like you just said, Robert, knowing that, okay, when we make a decision, what's the right thing to do here? Not what's the protective thing, what's the best thing for the institution or the gospel, what's the right thing to do? And maybe I'm naive, but I still believe, and I remember telling churches, say, just do the right thing. And the reality is, you know what the right thing is. You might convince yourself otherwise, but 9 out of 10 times, you know what the right thing is. Do it. And hopefully this process can help empower them and educate them to finally begin doing the right thing.
Yeah. Very good. Very good.
I was going to say, add to that too, like doing the right thing also by survivors, and not the right thing that I know a lot of churches will walk a fine line. I'm thinking of one investigation where the church did decide, I don't know if I can say this publicly, but they did decide to let the pastor go, but they ended up firing him for he wasn't truthful. So he was let go because he wasn't truthful with the grace team, rather than because of the allegations of what we discovered in our investigation. And can you just imagine like what that said to the survivor, that he was let go for that? And so it just, you don't have to make a statement on whether the investigation was true or the allegations were true, but we have another reason we can let this person go. And it's like, we can do the right thing because it's the right thing to do by survivors and not have to worry about, other things. So.
Okay, great. We've got time for just one more quick question, and then we need to wrap up. So one thing that I would say is that if we have not been able to answer a question that you had in the Q&A, can you please email us those questions, and we'll try and get a response to you within the next week or so. And you can email those questions to info@netgrace.org. That was info@netgrace.org. And then we'll try and get you a response to those questions within the next week or so. And even if you're just watching the recording of this, if watching the recording prompts questions, please send us an email with those questions, and we would be honored to be able to engage in a conversation with you about those questions. The last question, though, that I will take is it's a two-part. How do you pick where you do investigations? And we mentioned that already. Does it have to be current, or can it be from past reported abuse? And I would say in the time that I've been here at Grace, we've done investigations of allegations that have been 30, I think in one case, even more than 30 years old. And so those can definitely be historic incidents of abuse. And actually, sometimes that can be incredibly important to look at those historic incidents of abuse, because sometimes there's this historic incident of abuse and it wasn't handled well. And that planted a seed within the culture of the church, that created a wound within the culture of the church. And that wound has been festering for 10, 20, 30 years. And now there's just something in the church and people don't know what it is. People don't know where it came from, but there's just this sense in the church. We've had churches come to us and they say, we don't know what it is. But for the past 10 years, for the past 20 years, for the past 30 years, it seems like it has been one after another incident of abuse that is happening here. And now people don't trust each other and they don't trust leadership, and nobody feels safe. Help us understand what's going on. And often what we find is that 20 or 30 years ago, something happened and it wasn't dealt with. And so often it can be very important, even if it has been a long time ago, a historic incident of abuse, to be able to look at that, to address it, because those wounds are there. And if left unattended, they will just rot and they will fester like an open wound. And so that can be incredibly important to address those. I'm afraid that we do need to wrap up, but thank you everyone who stayed with us for, we were here 90 minutes. So thank you so much for everyone that came and watched. Thank you, Amy and Robert and Boz, for joining us on today's program and sharing from your wisdom. And thank you as well, Zane and Susie, for all the work that you've done in making this possible. We hope to see you all at future Grace Live conversations that we have as we talk about different issues related to abuse and the church. Please check out our website, www.netgrace.org. Please watch also, because in a few days, this recorded program will be on our YouTube page. So you'll be able to view it again there and share it with other people there. And then if you have additional questions, please do reach out to us at info@netgrace.org. Thank you again very much, everybody. And we hope to see you later.
Thank you so much.